We continue our themed coverage of all things under the Human Rights Day banner. This time we're joined by political scientist Professor Amanda Gouws of Stellenbosch University to discuss the meaning of Human Rights Day in the time of COVID-19. A very good afternoon to you, Professor, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity.
Now, Professor, let's perhaps start with how the pandemic has actually brought to the fore socio-economic inequalities, not only in South Africa, but also in the world at large.
Well, I think it shows to us the very big gender equality gap, but also in specific inequality gap between rich and poor countries, but also between rich and poor in one country. And South Africa is the country with the biggest inequality gap in the world. So what we've seen is that this disproportionately affects women, and specifically where women are also single parent heads of households, where they are actually, and this is the norm in South Africa, we have more single parent households than we have sort of the nuclear family with mother, father and children. And this has had an enormous impact on specifically these households, but also on women, where they, for example, did not have access to private medical health care. If you're reliant on state hospitals, there are all kinds of repercussions if you can't access the health care. There have been serious food insecurity, and there has been violence where the police and the military have been quite brutal in their treatment of people who broke the lockdown regulations. So we've seen all of this come together in a very visible way during the pandemic, because this was also the first time the whole world was faced with a situation that they did not make provision for and that they did not really know how to handle. And this is when we see that inequality became very stark in many ways.
Another issue we also saw, Professor, is that the legacy of apartheid's spatial planning left many households reliant on overcrowded taxis and trains as a mode of transport to get to work. And also densely populated residential areas made it very difficult to social distance even when you are at home. And for those that had to even isolate or self-isolate, they couldn't because of their home situations.
Exactly, and so this affects the people who are living in townships and in areas where the population density is very high. They made them far more vulnerable than people who could social distance and who live in houses where it's possible. So we need to ask ourselves the question that 26 years after we've transitioned to a democracy, why are we still coping with the legacy of apartheid and this sort of apartheid geography that does not make it possible for people to live in circumstances where they are actually, where they can exercise what we call second generation rights. And these are your substantive rights. So the right to a house, the right to decent health care, the right to education, and the right to a job. Now, in the Constitution, this is written as the access to these rights. But access is not really facilitated by the state. And we need to ask the question, why is it the case that the state is taking so long to change some of these conditions? So some of it's got to do with the legacy of the past, but some of it has also got to do with state capture and rampant corruption that has really taken away a lot of the funding for basically service delivery, the most basic of service deliveries that's got to do with people's very basic needs. And this is, I think, the question we need to pose is that why is it that the state is such a reluctant partner in this whole situation of service delivery on basic needs?
I mean, I spoke to a panel of young students earlier on who were saying that if the state can actually afford to bail out state-owned entities year after year after year with billions of rands, they can do the same for the education system. And also just on that theme of education, some reports have come out and they say that the closure of schools and universities will actually also have a disproportionate impact on learners and students from impoverished families and communities, especially when most of the learning currently is being done online and not everyone has access to stable internet connections, laptops, or even tablets or smartphones.
Well, exactly. And I think this is the issue here is that why is education, and specifically tertiary education, not prioritized? Because this is the only way to break the cycle of poverty is through education. Now, it is very difficult to give free education to large numbers of people. In many countries, that's not possible. But where we've embarked on a policy to make this possible, why is it that money is not reallocated? And specifically, as you now point out, it's affecting students from poorer communities and specifically rural communities disproportionately because they don't have access to the internet. And we can only do this online teaching that we were forced to do by the pandemic if people have access. So this is something that also needs very serious attention. And I have to say universities have really tried. They have provided, in the case of my university, but I also know about other universities, free laptops. They have provided data every month, and they have tried. But the problem is that if the connectivity does not exist, for example, in rural areas, then it doesn't matter whether you have a computer, you cannot access the internet. So we need to prioritize education to break the cycle of poverty and to ensure economic growth, because that's the only thing, if people have the qualifications to actually create jobs, that we will have economic growth. And this is becoming more and more not feasible in the situation that we are at the moment.
Now, you mentioned earlier on, Professor, how some people actually died at the hands of the South African National Defence Force. Let's talk a bit about that, the harshness of the lockdown regulations, first of all, especially during level 5 and invoking of the National Disaster Act by the President. How has that impacted people's human rights? I mean, the right to freedom of movement, you're not even able to socialize. When is it that the right to life becomes more important than people's livelihoods?
Well, I think this is a totally unknown situation for every country because it has never happened before. So it was a balancing act between those really very important rights, the right to freedom of movement, the right to life, the right to health, balanced against the fact that if there is free movement, that people may actually die from the pandemic. So the government had a very difficult balancing act. And I think that the Command Council really tried to deal with that. But we also see that there is a history here of dealing with people in a way that's quite violent and brutal. And this is what happened in some cases because people broke lockdown regulations. So that balancing act, even though it was supported by government, that doesn't mean that it was actually enforced by the police and the defense force. And that actually undermines people's right to life and the right to security that they are also entitled to. And I think this is, we need to look at the training of police. And women have been saying this for many years, is that when women, for example, come to report either sexual violence or domestic violence, they're very often treated in very brutal ways, not believed, and not taken seriously. And I think, there needs to be an understanding of what it means to have human rights in conditions, even though they are not your normal democratic conditions. Now, having said that, I also want to say that all rights come with obligations. Mm-hmm. And we very often talk only about rights, which is a very individual notion because it's a liberal notion that rights claims and rights bearing are vested in individuals. But those individuals also have obligations, and that means that they also have to bring their side to the table, and they have to also, understand that they have to. When they secure rights, there's also the issue of collective rights. So that if you're part of a community, you also have to consider the rights of the community. And I think this is here where, some individuals decide that they have the entitlement to rights as individuals, regardless of what that means for the contagion of other individuals as part of a collective. And that, again, was the balancing act. And I think this is also a thing that we need to educate South African citizens on, is that you cannot only have rights, but you also have obligations.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Professor, and for sharing those insights, the importance of actually being accountable for the rights that you are entitled to. Professor Amanda Gouws, who is a political scientist from Stellenbosch University.